Hello, testing. Two, mic two. Mic three. Mic one. Mic one's too loud. Mic four is good. We're going to start in about 2 minutes. All right. We're about to get started. I mean, they'll come here eventually. I'll let them know. Do you want to do a quick sweep of the bar? You want to do a sweep of the bar and let people know we're starting? All right, so we're about to start. Thank you for joining us tonight. Welcome back to PubKey Thursday. We have a very special meetup tonight. We have Breez and 1A1Z, and they're going to be presenting a report very soon, imminently, about Bitcoin as a medium of exchange. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. The reason we titled this event, It's Just an Electronic Transaction, has a little bit of a history to it. Does anyone here know why we called it that? All right, I guess not. So back when we were just about to hit 100K, we had a guest. We had Fox News come to do a live report from the pub. And this is what happened.
This is a Bitcoin Lightning Network transaction, which is instant and nearly feeless. There is a small fee, but it's nearly instant and with like low fees.
Okay. All right. We're going to do it really quickly, and you can ask me questions as he's doing that, guys.
We gotta jump, Lauren. It's just an electronic transaction. Okay. I love you, but we gotta run. Thank you.
So they were about to do a live transaction on the air, live on the air, and they got cut off from the studio because, it's just an electronic transaction. It isn't that what we all want to see? We want to see Bitcoin as the official medium of exchange where it's just like an everyday thing. Nobody has to worry about it. It just works. It's just the way we exchange values. So we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. We have Dan O'Prey from 1A1Z, we have Danny Stagg from Breez, and we have Umi Miyahara also from Breez. And yeah, well, I think it'll be a great conversation. If you have any questions, we'll have a Q&A later on in the event. But if something comes up that you don't understand, raise your hand. I'll come around with a mic, and we'll make sure that you get a chance to ask your questions. But I think you're really going to enjoy this one. So thank you so much.
Testing.
I'll trade with you. It was working like 2 minutes ago.
Quality start. Hey everyone, how we doing? We feeling good? Happy days, there we go. So, Bitcoin payments. I don't know why it's called that, because we're all going to discuss Trump coin and go, and that as a medium of exchange. No. So, I'm Danny, I work at Breez. Breez is a Lightning as a service company in which you can integrate Bitcoin payments into any app or service self-custodially. And we've been working with 1A1Z to produce this report. Now, Bitcoin payments, a lot of people have preconceived conception, like views on that and what's happened before and kind of where the industry's been. And the work that we've done through this report is kind of detailing where we are today. Hopefully, you can all leave here today with something and kind of go away and go, oh, that was quite interesting, and take it off into your days. And hopefully, we're able to persuade you where we think things are going, right? So the report is Bitcoin payments from digital gold to everyday currency. And yeah, that's kind of how we got going with this, wasn't it, Dan?
It was, yeah. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Dan O'Prey from 1A1Z. This is my co-collaborator, Mass, if you want to catch up with us afterwards. We're a research and advisory company focusing exclusively on Bitcoin and sort of wider freedom tech, closely related as well. Published one report so far on funding Bitcoin core developers. You know, Bitcoin's pretty unique in that it doesn't have a foundation or a pre-mine, so how do actually the people who work on Bitcoin get paid? Now we're collaborating with Breez on this report on Bitcoin payments, and we have one more coming with Epoch Ventures on Bitcoin native venture capital as well. So my only shill will be 1A1Z if you want to .com if you want to subscribe to those. And yeah, I think as Danny said, like the prevailing wisdom, the narrative, the thing that we hear in the media day after day, especially since spot ETFs, is this: Bitcoin's just a store of value. Bitcoin's a store of value. No one should use it. No one wants to use it. We tried using that several years ago, 2014, 2015. There were experiments, El Salvador as well as a first experiment in making Bitcoin legal tender. Satoshi's white paper was Bitcoin a peer-to-peer electronic cash. It wasn't peer-to-peer, stick it in a security and trade it on the New York Stock Exchange. We believe that that we will return to that, and actually the store of value narrative and the digital gold narrative is actually critical to have a medium of exchange future to that. Otherwise, that narrative itself won't even sustain. So. We'll talk a lot today about various different merchants, different businesses, different infrastructure providers, countries, presidents, who are helping revisit the original goal of Bitcoin and the early days of the traction that we're restarting to see in that space and what's changed since it was originally tried.
Anything to add, Ames?
I'll make a quick introduction. Thank you all for coming. My name is Umi. Like Daniel said, I work at Breez as well. I lead business development. And before we get started, I want to make this interactive and engaging as well. So feel free to raise your hand anytime as we speak. But first, has anyone in this room made a Bitcoin payment in the last maybe week or two? If you have, can you raise your hand? Lightning counts. It's Bitcoin. Okay. In the last week or two. Okay, I have 2 gifts to give away. So the 2 people who made the most recent ones get it. In the last week. We're still going. We got 2 people here. We get.
Round of applause, everyone. Well
Round
done.
of
Well done
applause.
on the medium of exchange advocates there.
Just proving that Bitcoin is a medium of exchange.
There you go, done. Thank you for coming, everybody. No, so as we've kind of gone through, anything else you want to add there? Or is it There we go.
Let's kick it off.
We've got it. So, as you've all kind of heard, this is what we're kind of talking about today. Bitcoin payments are here. They're being used for real payments. The report is detailing adoption, the use cases, and the kind of opportunities that we see happening. And let's start with the big thing that, as Dan said, everyone talks about on the news. It's everywhere you see it. I'm sure some of you even believe it. Digital gold. You see Saylor on the front of Forbes, was it today? And his big mug all over X and Nostr. Digital gold is the prevailing narrative. It has been the prevailing narrative. And one of the things that we have seen in Bitcoin and development is you can go back, right? Maybe it's apps with Ross now pardoned and free, but you started in illicit markets. There were then the mainstream organizations that jumped on board. Some of those then subsequently pivoted away. And people kind of went, Bitcoin payments are done. Let's go and move on to other means. And it's a bit of a false narrative, that. And the reason it's a false narrative is the technology that was at play 10 years ago is dramatically different. I imagine everyone in your lives now uses tech that wasn't even here a couple of years ago. And I think basically what we're trying to get to in the report is discussing that evolution means that kind of argument has gone. The technology we now have enables you to do things that you can't do with traditional payment methods. And kind of through learning through the report, we've kind of got to this place where I'm really excited. I don't know if anyone's on the spaces. I think I said it about 16 times about how excited I am. And that's not just because I work in this or passionate about Bitcoin. It's because I see something radically different to what we have. And I'm not saying that as a shill of Bitcoin either. I think there are areas we all need to improve on. And one of those is the narrative. But overall, just calling it digital gold doesn't really cut it. And I think, Dan, in the report you mentioned, you kind of referenced why that kind of narrative doesn't necessarily work.
Yeah, I mean, I think Bitcoin's really hard to explain to normal people. Most normal people don't necessarily care about peer-to-peer or censorship resistance or a lot of the things that us Bitcoiners like to care about or talk about in the back of a Bitcoin bar. And having that sort of helpful analogy to something that they can get their heads around, get some sort of 50% of the way there, which is better than zero. But it also is quite limiting, right? Bitcoin does share a lot of things with gold, particularly the limited supply, the hard money, the hard to mine and create portions of it. But really, if you stop there and you just think this is a scarce asset that's a hedge or an asset that I want to buy and hold long term because number will go up, then you're missing, in my opinion, the forest for the trees of what the real potential of this is. And like the internet did for information, Bitcoin can do for money. And Bitcoin is an internet native bearer instrument that has never existed before, that people still don't really understand. And that we'll touch on stable coins later, and the competition with those. Stable coins are not bearer instruments, right? Holding them are not, possession, they're not control. They're representations of offline assets. Now, for the first time ever, the internet has money. Back in the original HTTP specs, there was a payment mechanism that was missing and never fulfilled. And now we have that. And the potential for what excites me is what that can actually do for global GDP and global commerce, that everyone in the world has access to an internet native money that is free of borders, free of control, free of companies, free of political influence, that everyone can use and transact with and conduct commerce with. And I think, I don't understand the full implications of that, just like I didn't with the internet and Uber and Amazon and Netflix back in the day. But that is something fundamentally new, fundamentally different, that is so much more exciting than just buy it and hold it and wait 10 years and put it in your 401k. Right? This is a fundamentally new and different piece. So it's a helpful analogy, gets you started, but don't end there. Don't be limited by that. And as Danny touched on, don't be limited by the prior attempts when things were super early and the technology was not there and the market was not there. Things are very, very different now, which we'll touch on as well.
So I think as well, one of the key parts of this, and the internet is the easiest analogy, and we talk about that often, is the way that we now exchange information is radically different. And it's hard to fathom how easy it is now. We could stream this to anywhere in the world, right? And that's a game changer. My accent gives it away. I'm British. I don't, I'm not from here. But calling my parents, that would have been totally different, right? And just focusing on that one utility kind of undersells the opportunity we kind of have today. And as we've kind of gone through the research of this and kind of built the case, well, not really a case. You don't go into a report intending to have a case. You kind of put out a hypothesis, see what's there, and see what kind of comes back. And where we are today is incredibly early. If you just looked at the internet for exchanging information, what's the kind of way you can move information? And I think the movement of value needs to move at the speed of which information can now move. And with the adoption of Bitcoin and the integration within our day-to-day lives, look, a lot of you here today you're here for Bitcoin. But how do we get it to that next stage? Is that what we're trying to get to is everything's kind of here for us now. And if we can get all the stars are aligning very nicely so that when they talk about it just being an electronic transaction, that seamless element is here. Maybe 10 years ago when you looked at Microsoft with much fanfare, everyone wanted to be at the buzz, oh look, I've got that internet money, and then just kind of went, yo, see you later. But the technology wasn't there. And I use a crappy analogy, but I'm going to use it here. It's any of you video game fans thinking of the Dreamcast, and that had online gaming. That was one of the first that had it. The market wasn't ready for it. And I think if you start looking at Bitcoin through that kind of lens, that 10 years ago we weren't ready for the things that we have today, the tech's caught up, the infrastructure's caught up, and that's what we kind of learned through the report. So kind of where we go with this now is why now, right? And excuse the crappy slides. You don't need to worry about them. I just put it up to remind myself where I'm at, because I could go and meander. But the technology is the key part of the whole of this picture, the ecosystem of which Bitcoin payments works, from the top to the bottom. And the kind of underlying part of this is Lightning. Now, I know some of you, I think you gentlemen there spoke about using Lightning in the last week. Lightning is what unlocks this. It allows Bitcoin payments to scale. The issues that they faced initially was the slow settlement time. You can't scale the number of payments. There are fundamental issues that meant Bitcoin on-chain didn't work. But Lightning is offering us a solution here in which we're still early. There are criticisms of Lightning, and it was kind of oversold, is what we put forward in the report early. We've had 6 years of development. The tools are out, and Umi works very closely with some of those tools, is that we're bringing those tools now into products that fit your everyday life. And that means the exponential growth and time for Bitcoin payments is right now. And like I said, you see it quite often, don't you?
Yeah, so as Danny mentioned, what's really exciting, especially about the why now part, is that the stars have essentially aligned for the technology. A part of that being the Lightning Network, which is a layer 2 on top of Bitcoin that allows Bitcoin to really be the peer-to-peer money that it was meant to be. The Lightning Network has Bitcoin remain as the bearer asset, but it allows it to flow a lot faster and cheaper. So we see that in this world right now where people want instant gratification with payments, tap to pay, immediate settlement. The Lightning Network has now come to a point in the technological advancements of the tools that allow apps and services to embed Lightning is also here. So we're really early, but right now is the tipping point where it's all going to start kind of forming to snowballing in motion.
Yeah, and then just to give it a quick shout out to other attempts as well, Lightning is by far the most mature, but we're also seeing an explosion within Bitcoin of other L2s as well. We've got Arc, we've got Spark, there's eCash, Cashew, Fedimint, and a bunch of side chains as well. So those are a lot earlier, so we're rightfully focusing on Lightning as the key technology that unlocks that. It is materially different from prior attempts that were used in the past. But we're also just want to highlight the amount of innovation that's now going on in Bitcoin, which is often seen as sort of a slow-moving, boring cryptocurrency compared to some of the others. But now that is no longer the case, and there's multiple different layer 2s that are focusing specifically on payments, on bringing stable coins to Bitcoin, and that story is changing as well. But Lightning really is where if you want to take Bitcoin payments today, the only game in town.
Yeah, and the way that you can kind of see it as well is that Lightning will connect those sub-networks as well. It's the common language of which it uses Bitcoin as the bearer asset, and those other networks can all be tied together using Lightning, which makes these developments super exciting for how this development furthers. And the reason that, kind of doubling down on my point here as well, is that the major players are integrating. It's not just a case of a couple of big companies have done it. Right now, hundreds of millions of people can be reached by Lightning. That's not me saying some kind of superlative just to say it. It's a fact. And it's not just cryptocurrency, so crypto companies. So if you look at Coinbase last year, integrated Lightning. Nubank in Brazil, huge neobank for anyone who's familiar with it, integrated Lightning. This is a transition of the technology into the mainstream. And yes, I know a lot of you are probably very impatient as well and kind of like, come on, time's up, hurry up. But the technology's taking time, and to Dan's point, things do move a little slower, but the technology is the foundation of which all of this moves forward. So if you look at the foundation we now have, is that we're reaching hundreds of millions of people with Bitcoin, and they have access to it far easier than they've ever had before, with a technology that can real-time settlement, lower fees, and can scale to the kind of capacity that we want, which is worldwide, right? There's 8 odd billion people on the planet. It's calmed down today. We're not saying that. I'm not putting a big 8 billion and then selling that to the world. But what I'm trying to say is we've got the technology to get there. So that's kind of the exciting part of where we start, is kind of why now, right? So first point being digital gold. It's a bit more than that. Second point being, cool, you're saying it's more than that, then why now? And this is where we got to, right? And so if we move forward, oh, no, there we go. So we kind of alluded to this a little bit. And we put some of the points in. So I'm not going to go through the dry elements here, but why use Bitcoin payments in general, right? And so we've kind of gone through elements of that in the report. I don't know if, Dan, you want to do it because you're far more eloquent than I am.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, yeah, there's multiple different benefits. I think one of the interesting challenges that are kind of unique to Bitcoin is that consumers don't necessarily see a lot of the pain points, right? That's hidden away, or it's experienced by the merchants. So PubKey were a participant in the report. And they talk about chargebacks and the cost of payments, and every time someone buys a pint here with a credit card, they're paying 25 cents or more. That has just gone to paying to receive payments. Whereas with Bitcoin, that's completely free, right? And if you add that up, or almost free, if you add that up for the number of pints that someone of the scale of PubKey sells, it's a meaningful amount for their business, let alone with the chargebacks as well. And what consumers don't really see as well is that when you're using a credit card, it feels instant because the payment is different from a settlement, and it feels free because everything's already 3.5% more expensive than it otherwise would have been to cover all the issuing, bank and payment processing and credit card issuers that are involved in that chain. But all the prices are artificially inflated by the cost of actually conducting those payments. And from the merchant's point of view, for the instant settlement piece, the authorization of the payment is different from the actual settlement, the actual receiving of the funds, which can take 90 to 100 days later. So while you may be taking money at the bar, the consumer can walk away, that's great. You can't use those funds for a month or 3 months later. That creates a significant drag on the velocity of payments and the ability for businesses to actually manage their cash flow and use those funds for other things. So that instant payment piece of, again, Bitcoin being an internet-native bearer instrument, that the payment essentially is the settlement, means that those funds can flow at a much more rapid pace and be used a lot more frequently, and there aren't chargebacks, so once you receive those monies, you know that they're actually there to use. I don't know if this was going to be in a later point, but there was an example of a charity that they would receive donations from credit cards, $5. And then someone would charge it back, and they would end up having to pay a $15 fee. So the charity's losing, $20 of opportunity cost for nothing. Whereas with Bitcoin, when they receive those funds, not only are they instantly accessible, not only are they not having to pay, lose a bit of the markup for the credit card processing, but they're also irreversible, and they don't have to worry about, if that's going to be charged back. And that's a meaningful, at scale, huge problem and expense and administrative burden. We talk about, was it Water Trust, who have to face this issue every day, PubKey themselves, who are having to pay for this. So numerous different examples of how actual live, real-time, free, instant settlement can actually materially change the operations of a business, of a non-profit, of a merchant. And ultimately, that feeds back to consumers in the form of lower prices over time.
And one of the examples, so sorry to put her on the spot, but Umi has an example of what sometimes these problems can feel kind of unattached to us, right? So when we talk about chargebacks, you're kind of, yeah, okay, that person's dealing with it. But actually, when they decide to pass that cost on to you, that has a repercussion. And you had an experience at your PTA recently, right? So any parents might relate to this one.
So the use case of where I feel right now in my everyday life, and I'd love to hear examples from everybody as well later, where I think where Bitcoin could solve the friction point, I feel, as a means of medium of exchange or payment. Because usually in my everyday life, I can Venmo people. We're privileged. We're in the U.S., so why Bitcoin kind of comes up. But so I have 2 young kids. They're in a New York City public school, and I pay for their extended daycare that's run by the school. And the school, they recently added a new bill to the invoice of $9, and it's usually a $300 payment. So I asked them, what's this $9? And they're like, oh, actually, last year, the platform we use, we had to pay $45,000 in credit card processing fees to them, and we can't afford that, so we're passing it on to you, the parents. So there, I actually emailed them and said, do you accept Bitcoin? And she said, hold on, I'll check and get back to you. But it was interesting, the fact that the admin didn't immediately dismiss me. They actually took it back to consider, because it is a friction point. They're trying to solve it. And she said, we understand the pain. We don't want to have you take on those costs, but we don't know what to do. Everybody wants to pay online. We're digitally connected. We do everything on the internet now. But the only way to avoid the fee is if you write a check and bring it to the school every month. No one's going to do that right now in this day and age, right? We want to do everything online, but the only alternative is, and we've kind of normalized this, paying the 3%. You might see it on your local bodega, minimum charge. If it's $10, under $10, 5%, or even if it's if you're going to use a credit card at the bodega, we're going to charge you 5%. And that's normalized, and you kind of think, well, I get the 2%, 3% back in credits or miles, or you try to normalize it, but it's actually not normal. We live in a day and age where we can buy things online, exchange information online, connect online, but we can't transfer value online until now with Bitcoin. The tools are there. It just needs to be implemented, and we need to get builders, people implementing Bitcoin in their apps and solution. That's kind of not why used for everyday users like you and me, but for the apps and platforms that we engage with on a daily basis, why for them to use Bitcoin in their solutions for us to be able to access. But that was kind of my gripe of not wanting to pay the $9 every month.
But if you kind of think about that, right, it's a niche example, but it's an example that affects day-to-day life, and there's a solution at play that can fix it. And then if you start thinking about more, Umi kind of mentioned there about this is the first time we're able to do this, not using an intermediary to make a transaction or a third party in itself is a revolutionary idea. The idea that I don't have to rely on another party, that I can't, don't have to go, can I get your permission to do this, is why this is such a radical change. And you're right.
This is the question that is confusing me, and I'll admit I'm completely new to this, right? We can attest to that. But I get screwed all the time on my credit card charges because we live in this digital age and money moves fast like that, right? So I eat the credit card costs because I bitch and Amex all the time to give me my money back. I get your point about this is moving without the intermediary. What happens if I get screwed? Is there, what's the resolution for that?
This is a great critique, and I don't think I'm going to have the perfect answers here either. This is why I definitely say that we're at the start of this, but I think there are checks and balances that you can use, right? So there are custodial players, there are custodial options that maybe give you those securities, and maybe in the future there are business models around that. That could be a solution. I think one of the things what that recourse of protecting the consumer, there are benefits. I wouldn't lie, that's maybe a cost of doing a payment. But in some cases, you don't want to do that. So I guess, to answer your question, I think the market would dictate that, which is a terrible answer. But no,
I get that you're trying to answer, but like, if you end up with business models to protect the consumer in that, aren't they just going to charge me something like
but it's opt-in rather than compulsory.
I
Right?
think
That's
that's
the
a key point,
difference.
right? There's optionality. Right now, everyone pays 3.5% extra. I'm actually pretty weird. I don't have a credit card. I just pay for debit cards. So I'm subsidizing your insurance, basically, right? By accident, by virtue of not benefiting from the chargebacks or the points or the miles, right? So if you want to pay 3% extra and have those protections through a central intermediary, you're still free to do that. But now other people have the option to pay less if they don't want to have that as well.
Hey, yeah. We're going to come to stablecoins, I think, in literally like about 5 minutes. And I'll come back to it. And hopefully I'll be able to address that quite nice and put a nice bow on it. Does anyone else have any other questions? Because I'm actually... Yo.
Solana has like 80 million transactions per day, and Bitcoin has like 300,000 transactions per day. How do you want to bring back like millions of transactions to the Lightning Network or the Bitcoin network in general?
Well, how many transactions per day does the Lightning Network have, I would ask, as counter to that? Because you're asking about on-chain Bitcoin transactions versus private off-chain transactions, of which are not comparable. So yeah, Solana forces everything on-chain and tries to do everything through a single bottleneck, whereas Bitcoin developed in layers, a lot of which are private from public data. So yeah, it's not an apples to apples comparison in that regard.
Any other questions? I'm liking questions here. Should we crack on a little bit and then we'll get to the stablecoins? I promise you. Oh, go for it.
So, I don't know how relevant this is, but every time, and I even ran into a similar version of this problem, ironically, with Breez last year when I finally was like, oh, I'm going to do, like, finally Lightning now and figure out what all this stuff is, you like program this stuff, is that, like, I get the argument of, okay, like, everything with debit and credit cards, there's some sort of transaction fee, and people are like, cool, I can avoid that with Bitcoin, and then I try to get them into Bitcoin, particularly Lightning, and what kills them are the like gas fees to process the Lightning stuff, particularly when and now, I'll put it this way, I have a Lightning app that tells me, oh, if you're going to do these transactions, this is currently what the fee is. When I started getting people into Bitcoin, that wasn't calculable, so people would think it's like a credit card, and they put like $15 worth of Bitcoin on their thing, try to pay in that, and then it's like, no, and then it's like, well, how much do you have to store? Then they went online, calculated the number, and basically went, F this, you have to have so much Bitcoin on there that for your average working class person, this is basically like only like rich people can do transactions with this because of how much the gas fees are. Are there like, again, the newer Lightning wallets I use and have introduced to people will actually tell you up front this is around what it would be, but I'm kind of nervous about saying, oh, there's no transaction fees like credit cards, because every time, whether it's Bitcoin or the crypto, everyone hits the wall when they hit the actual gas fees.
Let's summarize that question for the live stream.
Yeah, just to check and confirm, are you talking about like on-chain transaction fees, or you're talking about the transaction fees required to open a Lightning channel?
I think that's what he's talking about, is like the cost of getting onto Lightning is expensive because you have to open a channel. And so there's the question of how do you manage channels and how do we get around the cost of having Bitcoin on a channel so you can process a transaction at the bar, for example.
So there are different solutions to different problems. If you are having more of a native Lightning experience, there are different challenges, and those are trade-offs, right? There are trade-offs for that experience. So that's, I would say, the cost of doing a transaction there is necessarily a trade-off for your self-custodial benefits that you get from it. However, in the last 12 months, there's been new developments and still are developments within the space. One of those being, and I can attest for this at Breez, is that we have a new solution that PubKey, an app that was recently, I think, is maybe promoted within the bar, they use it's called nodeless. Long and short of it, you obfuscate the lightning channels away. You use liquid and you do swaps between lightning and liquid. Self-custodial still have the same. You still have your keys. However, there's a trust profile change because you're using the liquid sign chain. That totally different experience. The things that you're talking about there, opening up channels and stuff like that, those things are being obfuscated from the end user. And I think to the point of where we're going with this and kind of where we're at today is the technology's maturing. I think even where you've been in the past, I think you're acknowledging that as well, is very early. This is, I'm not going to kind of shit you all, and you all know it. You're all Bitcoiners. You've all been around it. If you're not a Bitcoiner, welcome. But the technology's matured, and maybe the selling of Lightning early and what it was offering something that it wasn't necessarily at that point. And so kind of where we go to is the advances within the industry, the L2s that we're talking about. Obviously, we're going to see them in production soon, but you've got Arc, you've got Spark. There are various different other solutions as well. So I kind of see it as those UX challenges, whilst some of them are still there, they are very gradually being removed from the end user, and that's why we see today as kind of a starting point. We're not at the end result. We're getting there. So that's kind of, hopefully that answered your question.
Yeah, and I'll just touch on, go back to the optionality point, right? And to be honest, Lightning isn't the perfect solution. There are some architectural constraints that just are what they are, right? And providing liquidity and having to open channels and upfront pieces are not ideal. And things like Arc are trying to address that. But yeah, as Danny said, if you want the fully trustless self-custodial model, you are going to pay more in on-chain fees. Vast majority of users today, particularly going from where we are to the next phase, maybe they'll be using a new bank or a Zampo or an intermediary. They're still going to be benefiting from all the other pieces we talked about, not fully trustless, but convenient. They can have chargebacks. They can figure out ways to address some of those things. And then they don't have to worry about any of the complexity of channel management or liquidity management as part of that. I know that's not the dream, that's not the end state we want to get to, but that is a practical reality of the limitations of technology. It's going to be more expensive if you want fully self-custodial solutions.
Any more questions?
I think we addressed it a little bit on the spaces earlier, but we live in New York. Obviously, New York's a more difficult place for people to onboard to Lightning because of the lack of custodial services. The custodial services make it easier. It gives you more of that Venmo-like experience. Strike, for example, I've used it. It's a terrific user experience, and I'm sad that I can't access it in New York. If you have a New York ID, you have to get KYC'd. You can't use it. So what do you do to get onto Lightning? We've been putting together a list, and you mentioned that earlier. It's at the bar. If you have questions about which Lightning wallet you can use without having to go through the process of signing up for something that would ultimately be restricted because you live in New York, there are options for you. And there's a variety of options. So some require you to have channels. Some, like you were mentioning before with PubKey, a new wallet that's coming out from Breez as well, will have the ability to receive payments without having to open a channel. And we're just trying to make that process easier for people to understand so they can onboard and be able to use it. And it's a process for us because we have to test every wallet. We have to go through and make sure does this actually work with our POS? Does it work with our node? And we're getting some good results, but we're using that as kind of the research for how we can then educate people who come here who have those questions, who want to know how to use Lightning.
Yeah, and Daniel is currently kind of brainstorming a user testing. So if any of you continue your night here at PubKey and get a little bit tipsy, he's going to do drunk user testing of various wallets. So go over to Daniel. I'm sure he'll be interested in helping you out. But point being valid. And I think this is you mentioned about being in New York and the borderless nature of Bitcoin payments and I think is sometimes just naturally attributed to the unbanked, okay? And so straight away we go to the unbanked use case and we talk about that, and it's a very, very important use case. But being borderless also opens up so many other more options, businesses that are able to interact. I'm able to right now send money to certain, we use it as an example within the report with a company called BitNob. You can send money from here to Nigeria like that, and you can send about $10, right? And in the past, I used to work for a remittance company, boom. And one of the things that we were relatively good guys and made it a bit cheaper, but we weren't Western Union, who are scum. Sorry if anyone works at Western Union. However, my point being is that things don't have to cost that much anymore, and moving small amounts is also important. You used to have to save up an amount to send it. So naturally, moving across borders, money, they kind of become irrelevant. And that becomes even more interesting because, again, we go back to information. We can share this with someone in Timbuktu right now. Like, we can send it with... Information moves like that, and it's so important that value moves like that, because the opportunity cost, talking about the things that we lose maybe in finance today because of the protections we want, are a cost to the consumer, they're a cost to innovation. That 3.5%, let's use it, PubKey, if 100 of you have bought a beer today, that's 25 cents on each of those beers, gone, right? For the business, that value that could come back and be exchanged elsewhere. So I think there's so many other benefits for consumers, merchants, and the kind of way that we live today. Like, we don't live in the same 10-mile radius as we possibly did in the past. We live in an interconnected world, and so that money needs to move like that. Wow, I got on my high horse there, didn't I? Have we got anything else to add in this Y section?
Just move to the free state of New Jersey, which is superior
This
to New
is
York.
it. This is where life's probably going to take me. Anyway.
No, but on a more serious note, yeah, like the NYDFS are one of the strictest and hardest regulators, and it's pretty ridiculous to see on lists of custodial options, not available to people in Iran, North Korea, and New York. Like that is shameful. And I think given the new political climate, there will be pressure for them to make that more available, to issue more bit licenses, and to be more in line, or to have a federal overview overseeing that sort of licensure statewide. So, but in the short term, right, you missed an easy plug of using a non-custodial option like Breez, which is not subject to bit license and registration as far as I know. So you can still use non-custodial Lightning in New York as well, but yeah, limited options in terms of the convenient custodial side.
Exactly. So the stablecoins question has come up, and I think one of the things we just discussed is that Bitcoin is a digitally native way of paying someone. Stablecoins are not that. Stablecoins are a digital representation of that asset, i.e. the dollar. And for most people, what does that mean? That means you're at the whims of what regulatory decisions happen to the dollar. You are also likely trusting a centralized service. So if we use in the case of USDC, Circle, and they can be shut down and shut off. So short term, of course, and we discussed this on the spaces, stablecoins offer a perceived stability that Bitcoin possibly doesn't today. And I would acknowledge that. I would say, yeah, cool, I understand why people are using stablecoins. But if you move to the medium to long term, you're already seeing it today. And so this used what's happening in Europe with the MiCA licenses. I think it was actually announced today that Crypto.com, I think, have now delisted USD.
Tether.
Yeah, Tether. And so today in Europe. Don't quote me on that, but I'm 99% certain it was done today. And before that, Coinbase delisted. And I think OKX delisted certain trading pairs last year. Of course. There are things happening behind closed doors there, but the acknowledgement is still valid in that you can shut down that very easily. And if you have a centralized actor, you can shut down that means of payment. And therefore, the benefits that you have with Bitcoin outweigh that long term, because right now, we're not going to go into the weeds on like the financial system, etc. But the US dollar is dominant for a reason, and there's a reason probably 99.9% of stablecoins are the US dollar. The US hegemony is entrenched. But to kind of bring it back to this digital representation, what you're getting is not a digitally native asset. Bitcoin's a digitally native asset that you can exchange. This representation is not that. So whilst it has those benefits today, the regulatory shutdown, the centralization, pose risks in which some of the issues that we just discussed when it comes to why Bitcoin payments matter. And we use an example in the report. So in 2016, I think it was, I don't know if I imagine some of you may use Proton. But Proton was shut out by PayPal. One day they went, turned them off. And so then Proton pivoted to Bitcoin payments. They're back now, they use credit cards, etc. But it shows you the volatility of using a centralized service is that you can quite easily be shut down. And that's the fears that you have with stablecoins, which then veer into CBDCs and kind of a political world that I won't go into. But that's kind of the first bit. Is there anything you guys want to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, stablecoins are really like a patch on top of the traditional financial system, right? They're not actually, I think, as innovative as people claim, right? They're IOUs for promises for redemption that are held at central bank account of, in centralized bank accounts of cash or cash-like, backing, right? And then really all you're doing is exchanging IOUs that can be redeemed with that centralized company if you want to. Or if you can. So it doesn't actually solve a lot of the settlement challenges that we talked about. And really it doesn't even solve that big a technological problem. Like JP Morgan Chase tomorrow technologically could decide we're going to stop doing KYC and AML and we're going to let anyone in Argentina anonymously open a bank account. That would give the same effect as what stablecoins are essentially doing. Like it's a regulatory arb that is allowing people to have bank accounts at banks that they don't have accounts at. And over time, we are going to see clamping down on that. We already see like controls that are in place around these decentralized permissionless stablecoins where accounts can be frozen or blacklisted or controlled. And just like the regular traditional financial system, the US and other governments are going to want to see the same controls applied to stablecoins. And that's going to limit their usage. And that is why Tether is, by far and away the largest, is because they are the least compliant, and so the value there is the access to traditional financial systems without having to go through the same hurdles that are provided there. And so I think over time, stablecoins are just going to look a lot more like just online bank accounts versus Bitcoin, which is actually true possession-based bearer instrument. Yeah, was there a follow-up for that?
The question is, people would understand how stablecoins work more than Bitcoin because of the lack of price volatility, most likely, and also just the fact that it would cost less than making a credit card transaction.
I mean, I would personally argue that stablecoin transaction isn't a settlement. It is an exchange of liabilities, and you still have a counterparty that you ultimately need to settle through the traditional financial system, right? You're exchanging IOUs that at some point in the future can be settled, so there still is that counterparty risk of the issuer and the issuer's bank account behind the scenes. But yeah, I mean, the lack of volatility and the familiarity with the dollar, we haven't talked much about inflation. That's not really the point of a payments use case. Obviously, there are other benefits to Bitcoin outside of that. But in the short term, while stablecoins are allowed to exist as they currently exist, I do think they're a very appealing use case for many people, which is shown. I do think the potential and excitement around stablecoins is hugely overblown relative to Bitcoin. Like one of the things Danny mentioned earlier was, Bitcoin doesn't have a centralized, marketing department or CMO that's singing its praises. But in the course of this research, if you add up all the stablecoins market caps together, they're 9% of Bitcoin cumulatively combined against $2 trillion versus 9% of that. The actual usage and volume that are existing in stablecoins today is far, far smaller. And there are ways to dampen the volatility and abstract that away from both the user and the merchant by using Bitcoin as rails or automatically cashing it out on receipt so that the sender can send fiat, the receiver can receive fiat. Behind the scenes, that's going in and out of Bitcoin for the purpose of actual settlement, whilst avoiding all the issues that we've just talked about with traditional payment rails, and still getting the same volatility dampening fiat benefits as well if people prefer.
Any more? I'm loving this. I'm in. But I think overall, where we're trying to go to is the long term or medium to long term. This doesn't change much. That's kind of the underpinning of it. But I do get your point on narratives as well, or getting someone to understand it. It is far more familiar. But I think long term, to make the changes or get the opportunities that are like on the table, I don't see it. But whilst we're going on to that regulation, that exciting topic, basically through this report, there are 4 broad ways that you could regulate Bitcoin, right? And obviously there's been news today with El Salvador agreeing to some of the IMF's demands in stopping payments with tax and making it mandatory legal tender. But as we discussed on the spaces, net positive is that it's still a positive regulatory environment in El Salvador, and that's good. There's the private currency kind of treatment where I think it's up to 600 euros.
The monthly exemption rate in, was it Germany?
In Germany, and the cool part of that is that the medium of exchange or the money flows. Oh, did you have a question? No? Oh, you just wanted to shout for Germany, like it.
Shout out for Germany.
Yeah, there we go.
I will come around with a mic, so if you want to ask questions after this part of the talk, we can get them on the live stream too.
We have someone. I was about to try some German out, and then I just realized it's just Ich bin 12
Hello.
Jahre alt.
Hi, I use Breez myself, so I really appreciate the technology. But when you were talking about stablecoin, I think one of the obstacles for people to use Bitcoin as a day-to-day transaction is the volatility of it. I don't know if you agree, because it's quite difficult for like a working person who live paycheck to paycheck to even budget in terms of Bitcoin. So how do you see this obstacle to be resolved? Do you think it requires like a global Bitcoin adoption? So like there's like a 10 million Bitcoin, so it becomes stable at that time? Or do you think it could be earlier? How do you see the obstacle get resolved?
Do you want me to go? Or do you want to go?
You kick it off.
I have there's an analogy which my boss kind of used. We haven't discussed this at length in the report, but it was basically the way he explained it, and I might bastardize it a little bit, but today the reason for Bitcoin's volatility is if you think about it as an incomplete index, and the volatility is that trying to predict price makes it more difficult. Now, with the more velocity with the medium of exchange, the more people using it, to your point, that volatility kind of becomes less apparent as it ultimately stabilizes it. So the idea is that today it's quite hard to price Bitcoin as how do you price it, and that's why the market's so erratic with it. And the idea of being more velocity allows that trend to kind of ease down. That's the most simplistic view of it, and it's not arguably not an in-depth one. Did you have one, Dan, that you'd want to use?
Just touching on the other couple I mentioned in the stablecoin context of, one, there is just, from the merchant's perspective, there is auto sell to fiat on receipt, right? So from their perspective, they may never see the volatility or even touch Bitcoin. They're receiving Bitcoin, but all they see in their accounting system or their bank account is fiat. Then from the user's perspective, one of the things I'm excited about between the transition from digital gold store of value to Bitcoin native circular economies is just the idea of like Bitcoin as a rail, right? Like most people here are probably not familiar with what TCP/IP is, but they use it every day as the internet. I think the next phase of payments and consumer adoption will be people don't even know they're using Bitcoin. Businesses and users will be using it behind the scenes, and it'll be a settlement system where you're going in, from fiat to Bitcoin back to fiat, and both the sender and the receiver or the merchant aren't even aware that Bitcoin is the thing facilitating that behind the scenes, in the same way that they're not familiar with TCP/IP or HTTP or any of the various internet protocols behind the scenes. So I think that's to me, the biggest next phase adoption from the perception and narrative of where we are today is a settlement rail that users aren't even aware they're using.
We've got a question back here.
So do you see Bitcoin and other cryptos coexisting with fiat for a very long time, or do you see Bitcoin eventually replacing all fiat? And because if that's the case, then you get back to your volatility question, which is you're not going from fiat into fiat. Now you're just using Bitcoin. So how do you deal with volatility in that case?
I don't have like a time horizon prediction for that. You know, I do believe that good money beats bad money, and over time, given enough time, Bitcoin will beat, you know, fiat currencies. Personally, I prefer volatile currencies that can go up as well as down as to those that just go down. So, you know, every single fiat currency doesn't go up ever. Every year it buys less. Every year your purchasing power is weaker. So volatility isn't necessarily a bad thing there, because at least you've got some upside potential. But in that, you know, hypothetical, fully Bitcoinization, hyper-Bitcoinization future, once, you know, we're still in price discovery phase for Bitcoin. We're still figuring out, you know, is it just gold, or is it the future of internet payments, or is it something else? And so there's a price discovery element going on that's driving that volatility, mostly to the upside, and that will continue. But in that hypothetical future state where everything is using Bitcoin, volatility will naturally be dampened because the market cap will be so much larger, and there'll be less trading in and out of it to fiat currencies. So I don't know if that will happen or when that will happen, but a natural state of that occurring would be less volatility anyway.
Knowing the way the cycle is, Trump will probably announce it tomorrow, and that'll be it, right? And so, however, to kind of move back on the regulatory side as well, I think, so we talk about more favorable environments like Germany, private currency. If you were to ever think of a regulation that could kind of cause more friction for medium of exchange, it is capital gains in the US and elsewhere, or treating Bitcoin as property. When you look at the way that influences the conversation or influences how you all use it, I imagine a lot of you, some of you that have even used it, kind of sit there and go, oh, should I have done that? And that's terrible because of there's the kind of way. First, that's more to do with store of value, but the second point is that there's a headache that comes with then filing your taxes, and nobody wants that. We were talking about it earlier about Bitcoin purchases, and Dan made a Bitcoin purchase for a watch a couple of years ago, and now he regrets it because he lost the watch. But the point is that if you were to think of regulation to slow us down, that's arguably one of them. And then you got the places where it's restricted and banned, and you can restrict it to an extent, but obviously there's ways that money moves. So I don't know if there's anything else we want to talk about on the regulatory side right now.
No, I think that, you know, that is a hurdle, right? The notion that when you spend money, you have to calculate your cost basis, and a lot of apps are actually making that a lot easier. If you use Cash App or any of the equivalents, then they will do an end of year, you know, filing report for that. So it's getting simpler and simpler, but it's still, you know, a mental friction and administrative hurdle that you have to go through. So certainly, I think, you know, as you mentioned earlier with Germany, and I think the Loomis bill that's coming through now has a monthly exemption. I could be wrong about that, but there are more and more, you know, proposals to actually have, like, you know, up to $1,000 a month is tax-free. Beyond that, you pay capital gains. That seems like a perfectly reasonable and not too IRS, you know, impacting solution to that issue.
Anyone have any questions at this point before we move on? No one likes regulatory chat. Like, let's just move on from that part, right? So, the case studies, right? And so, throughout this, started a couple of months ago on this report, and it's really been kind of enlightening to go through and talk with businesses all over the place, right? And these are just some of the ones that we've spoken to. But as you pull it together, to Dan's point about using Bitcoin as Rails or using it natively, there's so many different applications that are being used today, and I think that's quite exciting. And within the report, what we're trying to, or what not what we're trying to, or where we've kind of come to, is showing where we are today and how the platform's set for where to go. And I'm using a couple of examples. Obviously, PubKey, shout out to the guys here. They've contributed to the report. I think there was obviously a seminal moment here with the president buying a burger over Lightning. Regardless of what you think of the man, it's still a notable moment for that to happen, that a president does that. And I think the main point that came from the PubKey team was that cost saving on using Bitcoin over a card transaction. You can't really, the merchant takes a lot of those costs on, and running a business like this where the margins are what matters, those things are game changing. So using Bitcoin payments there for PubKey was one of those. The one that I like to shout out a lot about is Macari. I don't know if you wanted to shout about Macari because you introed me to them.
Sure, I could talk a little bit about Mercari. I assume if you're based in New York, you've probably seen ads for them in the subway or on buses as well. They are a Japanese peer-to-peer marketplace app that's global now. So I think in the U.S. it's a different app, so you can buy goods from Japan. That's pretty cool, and receive them. In Japan, when I first started using Mercari, it was I could buy my kids' shoes on there, and I could sell my kids' clothes, and it was just like a marketplace app, mainly women, but it's blown out to a full-fledged, just mainstream app. There's 23 million users in Japan, all buying and selling things peer-to-peer on it. And what's really unique is they launched the ability to buy and sell Bitcoin on it. So first it was a trading Bitcoin app that was introduced. And then what they saw was that people would buy so I'd be a housewife, let's say. I'm selling my kids' shoes. I've earned some yen, right? Let's say I have 2,000 yen. It's sitting there in my Mercari app, and I see this button that says buy Bitcoin. I'm like, why not? Why the hell not? I just made some money selling my kids' clothes. So then I buy the Bitcoin. It goes up. Now it can be 4,000 yen. So I was like, oh my gosh, sweet. I can buy some more clothes for my kids. So they saw this pattern of users that would take their earnings from what they've sold on Mercari, buy Bitcoin, sell it, and then buy more things. And so they said, okay, there's a clear pattern of people wanting to use what they've made for purchases and payments. So what they introduced was actually natively people being able to buy the Bitcoin, but then use just that Bitcoin to buy other things from other people. So they allowed Bitcoin to be payment. So if I wanted to buy stuff, I could just select, I'm going to use that Bitcoin to pay for books or bikes or different hand-drawn postcards, which I actually sold on Mercari myself. But point being, Bitcoin could be payments, and since they launched, immediately they had over 100,000 Bitcoin payments immediately go through in the first month or so. And it's kind of an incredible use case that's not that widely known much in the Bitcoin community, but in Japan, you can easily just use Bitcoin to buy things.
Yeah, I mean, just to highlight that, that's really cool that they didn't launch Bitcoin payments. They launched Bitcoin trading, and then they noticed from consumer or user patterns that they were actually trying to use it for payments, and then added that. So I mean, that's just a great endorsement of the value of that.
And 23 million users. For the trading service itself, over 2 million used that within the first year, which is wild when you think of what Umi's just described. And so it's funny because these stories and I said, as we've talked to various businesses around the world, you're kind of getting an impression, I think sometimes guilty of being in the US, we have a bit of a US narrative, and that narrative maybe permeates far stronger that you miss what's happening elsewhere. And I think another good example of that is Pick and Pay in South Africa. If anyone saw, there was an Adopting Bitcoin South Africa conference last week, and some people mentioned about Pick and Pay. So Pick and Pay is a grocery retailer. It's South Africa's largest. And they initially explored Bitcoin payments before the technology was there. Didn't work. Processing times, settlement costs, they were like, nope, not doing it. A couple of years later, the same guy who'd initially spoke to them came back, and he came back with a Lightning offering. And so they've integrated Lightning payments, and the long and short of it, every X% that you can imagine, numbers gone up in usage, and gradually is going up. I think around the average monthly spend there, which is significant for the South African market, is around 55K a month with just Bitcoin payments. And this is organic growth. This isn't being kind of marketed heavily. And so what you're now seeing is folks using Bitcoin for payments, the way that we're talking about it. And so these are just some of the examples we've seen. As Dan mentioned earlier, we spoke to some non-profits that use it. Charity Water is an example. I don't know if anyone went to the 2021 Bitcoin conference, and they announced they were doing a Bitcoin water trust, and that value of that $4 million that people donated is which they held up until I believe it's coming up this month, is now worth $10 million. So imagine the impact of what those donations have. Both use cases are satisfied there in that you're donating with Bitcoin, and then they're getting the benefits of that by hodling it, which is wild, right? 10 million, the impact that they're going to have as a non-profit is going to be enormous. So that's just some of the other examples. We've also spoken to an Italian furniture store, which was an interesting one, called Mondo Convenienza. If any of you are Italian in the room, we spoke to them. They accept Bitcoin. And a lot of these companies do this as well, initially for marketing. So to go back to those companies that did it in 10 years ago, they did it because they wanted to be seen as innovative, but it didn't work out. Companies now are coming to it maybe with that approach, or have in the last couple of years, and are now seeing that net benefit too. So they're not just seeing this whole shiny look at us, they're seeing how it affects bottom line and that consumers want it.
Yeah, I mean, one other call out is, you know, the online services, right? We mentioned Proton on like VPN and private email, but also, you know, Namecheap for DNS and domain registration. You know, they've seen, what, $73 million of Bitcoin payments over the last couple of years. Like, you know, meaningful amount of money for, you know, relatively small business.
Big shout out to Namecheap. They're
Big
great.
shout out.
I've used them.
They help you buy PubKey.com?
We actually do have one of our domains there.
Nice. So yeah, I mean, so yeah, it isn't. Yeah, I think a lot of them used to be like PR stunts, frankly, right? They were, hey, we're accepting Bitcoin payments. Look at us, aren't we cool? Give us a promotion. But now it is actually, oh, there are, you know, it's not all $2 trillion that's flowing through it. Again, like 73 million is still not an insignificant amount of revenue for a single, you know, relatively small company. So there is actually meaningful usage and meaningful business reasons to do it beyond the PR and marketing impact.
So it's pretty. Anyone have any questions on this part about any of the people that we've spoken to? You don't have to. No? So
I have one about
Go
South
for it.
Africa.
Go for it.
So I understand that you were talking about the supermarket there that's using it. Are the customers, how are they acquiring Bitcoin? And do you know anything about whether they hold it long term, or are they mainly using it day to day just to buy and sell products?
I'd be speculating, if I'm being honest, on some of that, but I can answer kind of an adjacent question: is how the technology works. So one of the interesting things, it's a company called Money Badger, and one of the things to integrate Bitcoin payments into these services is to bring it into the point of service tools that you currently have there. And so it's a big cost for a lot of merchants to integrate Bitcoin payments. I spoke to I think it was called Sandpiper, which is a company in Gibraltar that do franchises that implemented Bitcoin payments, but had challenges because of having to operate two POSs. So what they've done in South Africa, which I think is really cool, is Money Badger have worked on a way, and I'm going to lose my kind of the description. You might be able to help me here, Ooms. But basically, the idea is that you can use your whatever wallet, and it will read the QR code from this POS, and then translate that back to a Lightning payment. This is the most simplistic version of what I'm explaining. So the idea is that you can, archaic POS, you can turn up, use the QR code and pay. And that's how they've made it happen there. So I can't answer your question specifically on why they've got to the Bitcoin, but I can tell you how they paid. And so what's cool with that is that then this this feature is something that, in fact, part of our SDK, we've implemented it now, so that any app that uses the Breez SDK can pay using this tool. And it's open source, it's free and open source, and you can go and check it and have a look. But I think that's really cool. So to answer your question, can't get to why the people have got there. There's a need, and in South Africa, Luno is a very popular platform that people use in the country. So Bitcoin and cryptocurrency adoption is naturally higher there because of that service. But how they've got to pay is really cool as well. And that's why, mentioning back to the tech, that tech is changing, it's changed the game. It's made these things a reality in the way that a couple of years ago it wasn't. Anything to add? Magic. So, kind of getting towards the end of our spiel here, and kind of summarizing what we've learned from the report. And I think the main three things that if I was to take away, and when you do read it next week, hopefully next week. But if you read it next week, I'd love your feedback on it. Are these three things. So Bitcoin adoption, Lightning adoption is growing. There are new integrations now that are reaching hundreds, and I'm not just giving you superlatives here, hundreds of millions of people are reached. I'm not saying used, I'm saying reached. So the foundation there is ready to scale. People have access to these tools that they didn't have before in a way that just wasn't possible. And that reach growing and those integrations growing is only net good for Bitcoin. The second point, which to go back to why Bitcoin and that digitally native, internet native utility, is that you're able to do things that you can't elsewhere. I don't know if anyone of you are on Nostra and you do your zapping. I don't know if any of you use Fountain or Giza to donate, or Thunder for games. And Thunder are featured in the report. They've been awesome on this, but micro deposits, streaming payments, these are things you cannot do in traditional finance today. And that's not me throwing out superlatives as a Bitcoiner going, yeah, use it. This is things that are happening, and it makes so many more use cases as well. The way that you have your online life, what needs to happen now is these things need to be integrated within it. And that kind of then takes us to a kind of new level. And then the kind of final part, which we kind of addressed in the last bit, is real-world adoption. We're seeing it. And throughout this report, you're talking to various companies. We talk to LM Markets, the trading service. We talk to a Bulgarian gaming company called Imperia Online, 20 million users, and they use Bitcoin as a payment method. There are so many different verticals, industries, anyone that can be affected. So that's the kind of three takeaways that I kind of got from it, or we've got from it. Anything that I'm missing?
No, I don't know if this was later, but yeah, I mean, just to highlight why there is great traction, it is still early, right? This is, as Danny said, there's hundreds of millions of people who have access, who have accounts at entities that do provide access to Lightning. They're not all using it yet. Not all people are using actual Bitcoin for payments. Some of them are doing it fiat to fiat. But this is all driving demand and usage at the infrastructure in terms of liquidity, in terms of the channel management and pieces we talked about before, which is forcing the industry to build the infrastructure there so that it can scale. And we're seeing great traction on top of that in early stages, not in the tens of thousands, but in the millions or tens of millions, or actually hundreds of millions of users that have access, as well as actually, number of merchants that are seeing not just PR benefits, but business benefits too, including this one.
Anything to add, Ames? We're good? So, what do we do next? I think that's the kind of area that we kind of get to, is we're just getting started, and we want, and it's a key part of the report, and how we talk about this is we are at the beginning. It's just getting started. I think a lot of people have sold a false promise in the past of where we are and maybe where we're getting to. And there are other services out there that maybe have a bigger marketing budget, because the CMO of Bitcoin is all of us, right? So one of the things that as a learning that I would take from this report is integrating into more mainstream apps. I've alluded to this, but more, when we say mainstream apps, it's that everyday application. Sending an email, you can send a Bitcoin payment. Imagine it in your, you guys don't use WhatsApp, it's mainly Europeans, but if you do use WhatsApp, in WhatsApp or iMessage, and attaching a payment to it. And imagine, like we said about streaming with podcasts, or if you're using Facebook Messenger or Facebook Marketplace, we have a currency that is borderless, permissionless, can be easily integrated, and can scale to billions of people. The next step is getting it to those people even more. We have a great platform with hundreds of millions of people we can reach, but the next part of it is getting those everyday experiences. Do you guys, anything that you would add to that?
No, just reiterating that we want to see every app that you have when you open on your phone that you use every day to have Bitcoin payments in it, Lightning payments in it, and it to be really seamless and easy. Right now, we finally have the tools to allow that, such as the Breez SDK and others. So we want to see it more part of being natively a part of your everyday life in what you do. And that's kind of getting to the builders and the platforms and the apps to implement Lightning and Bitcoin payments. We're already starting to see, earlier than expected, traction on that front. and it's just the starting point right now.
Nothing else to add? Yeah.
Magic. And I think I talk about my Nan Margaret often. She's awesome. And she uses every app going, right? And my kind of litmus test of where we're going to is if my Nan Margaret can use Bitcoin. She's awesome and she would use it. And I'm going to WhatsApp her and tell her that I've mentioned her to all of you. She'd be really happy about it. But I think that's kind of where we're going, right? It's that mainstream adoption. It's that everyday app. And if you can get there, then off we go. And I think the next thing is the better tools for developers and bring in the tools. Umi alluded to it just then, right? We want to give the tools and the access to the builders to build those products. And they're there now. That's the cool part. And it's getting it to them and the education that comes with that. And I think underpinning all of this, which is the last point, is education itself. It's shifting that narrative. It's not saying that Bitcoin isn't a great store of value. All of us here probably can attest to that. That's this fantastic store of value. And like Dan's comment earlier, rather an appreciating currency than a devaluing one. Yeah, so do I, right? That's what we want. But the two, it's a false dichotomy for it to be one or the other. It's both. And there's a great piece by the CEO of the company, Breez. You should read it. It's about Bitcoin's false dichotomy. It's on Bitcoin Magazine. It's a long 20-minute read, but it's a good 20-minute read. And I think that false dichotomy is an issue because it isn't just one or the other. It's both, and it has to be both because you can't have a good store of value if you can't exchange it because that makes no sense. So I think the more the shifting narrative highlights the cases that are out there, the use cases, the people, the story, the demand, we get to where we want to get to.
Please go spend some Bitcoin at the bar.
Yeah, I think we're basically wrapping up. So that is where we're at with the report, and it's been a really nice to chat to you all about it, and hopefully you've taken away some valuable learnings that you can go on with. And the report will be coming out next week, bar a disaster, and we'll share it and just
Yeah, feel free to connect with any of us. Feel free to scan. That's all of the links basically for me on that QR code, but feel free to connect. I also wanted to open it up obviously for questions, but for some of the people that raised their hands earlier and for others that have made a Bitcoin payment in the past, if you're comfortable sharing what you used that payment for, I'd love to hear. I think it's cool to find out what right now people are using Bitcoin payments for.
And if you've ever regretted making a Bitcoin payment in the past, that's okay too.
I heard from 21 sats on Nostro.
Okay.
Zap 21 sats on Noster.
A great example of something that's not possible with a traditional debit card rail. For those that aren't familiar, Nostr is a decentralized alternative to Twitter where instead of liking, you can send a little bit of money. So as a content creator or a poster, you can earn money by posting, and as people like, you get small amounts of Satoshis.
Do you have a question?
Oh, thanks. First of all, thank you for having us hosting this event. It's very insightful, very thought-provoking. My question is a multifaceted one. I'd say maybe 2 to 3 parts, and it just talks about all the requirements, I should say, about being money, right? It's like being a medium of exchange, store of value, and then a unit of account. I think store of value, Bitcoin has already proven that. Just look at the price action from the banking crisis of 2023 and its price appreciation. Do you think we solve the volatility aspect of price if future instruments or financial instruments are denoted in Bitcoin? So like you'd have international trade, for example, the dollar is so powerful because 94% of all transactions are settled in the dollar. Do you think that problem will be solved if you have instruments that are just finalized in Bitcoin terms, like a million sats or whatever you want to call it? 2, in terms of medium of exchange, we're kind of already there. We're seeing the early tech, kind of like you mentioned. Do you think we solve that problem with AI being like the currency for AI agents, for them to interact? And how would that change if you view Bitcoin as like a public good? Basically, you can access global markets and liquidity if you just set up a wallet versus going from public to private. And then in terms of unit account, we have to live off of Bitcoin, like the Bitcoin standard. I think that's the end game. We're in the hyper-Bitcoinization phase. So like, how would you incentivize people to get on Bitcoin, right? You need to be able to pay your bills off of Bitcoin, your rent, your coffee, you basically need to have another rule-based governed monetary policy or framework. Sorry about the multi-loaded question, but what do you think about that?
Lots of questions in there. Yeah. So the first one, just to be clear, you're asking about the unit account when you say like so international trade priced in Bitcoin, but not necessarily or settled in Bitcoin. I think that, yeah, as you say, like the store of value, medium of exchange, and unit of account. I think that we're early in the medium of exchange piece. It is being used, but it's not being used at global scale. Bitcoin's just starting to be global scale for store of value. Medium of exchange will come next. Unit of account is going to be tricky given the volatility, and so I think there will be likely some form of like more stabilized derivative based on Bitcoin that could be used as that unit of account, but like in likelihood the US dollar will be that for quite some time unless they ruin it even more. So on the first point, but settlement could still be done in Bitcoin regardless of unit account.
Second was AI.
Second question on the machine to machine, like AI bots. Yeah. And there's already some companies doing some really interesting stuff. There's fusats.com who are creating a way to if you're using like ChatGPT or an AI agent and you want to do like a new service that it doesn't support, like you want to send a text message or you want to send an email or do some web scraping or whatever the third-party service may be, you can on the fly dynamically discover and add other services and pay them in Bitcoin, right? Obviously, those accounts can't create a bank account or make a payment from a traditional debit card. You could pre-fund these autonomous agents, and then they could spend out of that balance, but they can't sort of pay as you go. So yeah, the ability to essentially dynamically create an internet-native bank account that machines can use. I don't know where that's going to go. I'm not going to pretend I know where that's going, but it feels like potentially huge use case as things shift towards more payments where a human's not involved.
Third question.
It was just like unit of account. Essentially, being able to live off Bitcoin and kind of get to like a Bitcoin standard, right? Like no one's going to use Bitcoin because of the learning gap. That's just like the first obstacle, and then it's like for the business or the merchant, it's like if I take Bitcoin, then what can I do with it? Most likely, if you look at El Salvador, people like you sell the Bitcoin and interact in dollars, so it kind of defeats that purpose. So that's why I mean, like we need to be able to build the tech. That's why kind of like the institutions at Wall Street is kind of a double-edged sword, right? They bring on the users, but you also kind of sacrifice the centralized aspect of it because you're still trusting an intermediary at the end of the day.
Just one point on that. I don't think you're sacrificing. You're still got the option not to use them, right? So the centralized governments or financial institutions adopting or offering Bitcoin-based products aren't hurting the decentralized self-custodial. In fact, they're helping by driving interest and adoption and usage on the underlying technology. But yeah, if everyone just stopped there, then there wouldn't necessarily be a material payment implementation over it.
I wouldn't want to hypothesize on something like that because I think it's hard to say when something like that happens. But is it a path that's possible? Of course it is. I think that's kind of where you're at. And I think to Dan's point there, it's that these two approaches, decentralized and centralized for simplistic terms, are happening concurrently, and they both drive the conversation closer to answering that question. So I don't think we could answer that question. I think you can get there, but I think we're at the start, so it's a long way to go.
And just one interesting data point on that for like entities that have created products that are highly centralized. So on like PayPal, for example, if you bought Bitcoin, you couldn't deposit Bitcoin or withdraw Bitcoin. You do fiat in, buy Bitcoin, sell Bitcoin, fiat out. Over time, they opened that up and they allow you to deposit and withdraw. Now with ETFs, obviously centralized, fiat in, buy ETF, sell ETF, fiat out, but now even like BlackRock are applying to allow you to redeem your ETF for Bitcoin. So these are helping people get on board, and then over time they're giving them at least the option to withdraw. Now, will people do that? Do they do that statistically on most like exchanges? Most people are just looking for price appreciation, so not actually that many people as a percentage do deposit and withdraw and participate in the rest of the economy, but it's growing slowly over time, and the option to opt out is still there. And even centralized products are being forced more into that direction over time. So personally, I don't see it as a threat. I just think that there's less free and open Bitcoin in circulation, but that actually is just an arbitrary number anyway. And certainly centralized solutions are not detracting from the decentralized options.
Hi, sorry. Hi, my name's Colin. I had a question. I think we touched on regulation, but I was hoping to answer like the why now question specifically from like the lens of regulation.
Within the US or globally or?
Both. Starting with the US.
I mean, my honest answer there is I think domestic payments in the US are not going to be the first adopters, right? Because the need is not as great here as it is in other countries where financial access is harder, where payment systems are more expensive, where remittances are 12 to 15%. So the US is not going to be a leader in domestic Bitcoin payments. Just because of the need is not there. We're going to see it elsewhere. We're seeing a lot in LATAM in particular, a little bit in Africa. They're going to drive the adoption of the new technology because they have the greatest need. Then over time, that will globalize into markets that have more developed payment networks.
I'd be interested, we mentioned it a bit earlier about there was a bill proposed by Senator Lummis and Gillibrand, and I'd be interested in how that would affect the US. I'm not saying it would have a dramatic effect, but I'm saying I'm interested because allowing it to have a more favorable regulatory treatment will free up that medium of exchange. So the concerns that we currently have to make a Bitcoin payment kind of go out the window, and that opens up a world in which the movement is much more free or much more closer to how our fiat moves. So I think that's a thing to consider, and maybe with a more favorable administration, that changes the outlook. So, not concrete answer there, but hopeful answer.
How does Breez do things with like AML or KYC?
It's a self-custodial solution. So, i.e., there's no KYC or AML because you are in control. You're not a money transmitter, so you have your keys, and you're good to go. Okay. Ooms?
Yeah, if you're not, if the platform or service or infrastructure you offer is self-custodial, that means you're never in the funds flow. So you never touch anyone else's funds. That means that if it's self-custodial, you're the only ones that have access to manage, move your funds. And in that regard, you don't need to follow or require KYC, AML, jurisdictional regulations, things like that. That allows Bitcoin. If it's self-custodial Bitcoin, then it's truly peer-to-peer and global.
And just to clarify on Breez as well, Breez provides, there is a Lightning wallet app, but Breez's predominant business is their SDK. And so that SDK is implemented in a number of apps globally. And so they then provide the self-custodial solution. So like Yopaki, the Bitcoin neobank, uses the Breez SDK to offer a wallet to its users. There's a gentleman over there.
Yeah, my question is more tailored to like the later part of the presentation when you guys talk about like the next phases, getting companies to implement in something that we could kind of be using on a daily basis. So more focused in like the United States, how do you kind of see, more Fortune 500 companies trying to utilize Bitcoin? And then what are your thoughts on like the regulation? Obviously, the more these companies are implementing Bitcoin and people are using Bitcoin, it makes the US dollar less valuable. So kind of what's the thoughts on, these companies getting regulated? And obviously we're in a pro-crypto administration, but, the goal is to still have the US dollar be the main form of currency.
I was going to say, on your second question, I'm not as confident to tackle on the first one of where I see companies going. A good example would be someone like X, and I know they're not going to do it, but I think it's a bit of a dropped mistake, an opportunity lost for them. If you think about X wants to be the everything app, and I believe Elon wants payments within and they've just done a deal with Visa, but that means you need to get regulated in all of those jurisdictions, and that's a nightmare to do. And if one jurisdiction decides to not play ball, that shuts off those users, and then you have different processes that work and different markups. And so the way I think there's two phases, and Dan mentions this often, is there's Bitcoin as Rails. And so in the report, we use a company called Osmo that use Bitcoin. Bitcoin's obfuscated from the end user. You can remit money from A to B, you don't see it, but in the back end, it's all Bitcoin. That's option one, and that drives Bitcoin in the hands of people and familiarity. And then there's option two, which is those self-custodial, which is the option that I see having the most long-term solution, which basically means that you're in control. You're in control of your funds, the third party doesn't, and then you'll be able to use that balance across multiple apps. Today we're not there, but the dream would be that you have this internet native currency that you can use in this balance. So even the concept of wallets is a bit archaic. You know, some of you, I'm sure, have like 5 different wallets with Bitcoin here and there, or even more. The future is in which you have one balance that you interoperate, and it's seamless. That's where I kind of think about it. I don't know about you guys.
On the second piece with competing with the US dollar, like I think that's one of the, I guess, values of the digital gold comparison is to de-threaten the powers that be that it's not a competing currency. And sometimes when I hear some of the people speak, I wonder, like, do they not fully understand what Bitcoin is or what it could be, or are they deliberately trying to like make it non-threatening to regulators and legislators and central bankers so that they don't have a counter against it? I mean, to say the quiet part out loud, like the goal of Bitcoin is to end the Fed and to replace the dollar, right? So it is a threat. And the longer it stays under the hood as a threat, potentially the better treatment it gets and the more likely it will be to succeed in that end goal. So positioning it as not a threat may be advantageous in the short run, but I mean, it is.
Anything? We good?
Any more questions? We're going to take one more if you have it. We've been going about 90 minutes.
Thanks so much. This is great. So Amazon, all their sophistication, AWS, private blockchains, why don't they offer Bitcoin as a payment option?
The question is, why doesn't Amazon offer Bitcoin as a payment option?
I think, you know, no large corporation, not to pick on Amazon particularly, but Meta, Apple, Google, right, none of them offer Bitcoin as a real payment option. Microsoft dabbled with it, but not in a serious material way. I think it was just the Xbox store for a limited period of time. You know, the best example that we've seen is Meta attempting to create Libra/DM, right, the quasi-decentralized, you know, consortium of basically private blockchain, private currency. And the end result of that is it failed and Congress shut it down, and now David Marcus and his team are working on Bitcoin and Lightning because they realize, you know, the mistakes of that project, and now they're working on the thing that we believe will be the most successful. So they are actually, you know, Lightspark is their new company. They're doing a ton, including a new bank adoption, the Coinbase adoption, to drive Lightning and Bitcoin payments adoption globally. And so, you know, large companies will not be the first movers. They will get there, and often they have, you know, different incentives, and, you know, creating your own coin, your own payment. You know, Amazon coin maybe, you know, I'm sure was studied a lot internally for quite some time, but ultimately they'll all come to the same conclusion that Meta and Lightspark did. Amazon Prime? The Amazon checkout.
The thing is, even with this as well, it's a cost to the business. So there's an element where I'm looking at, so let's use Amazon as an example. This global business, I sometimes have to buy gifts for relatives back home, and I have to dabble on the Amazon.co.uk store. It is a real pig to use and do things like this. And where I'm getting to with this is those payment processors are different in every jurisdiction as well, and how they move money. So for Amazon, it's a little bit like going, hey, why are you doing this? Jeff Booth, he often mentions why pay to take payments and why pay to take payments in a devaluing currency. And as a merchant, it's a bit of a no-brainer that it's not I kind of feel like they kind of need to see where it can go, and I think maybe why not? This speculate is because of the narrative and the user demand today, right? We're very early, and it takes the innovators to go, let's go to that next level, and we're seeing some today. That's the cool part. But I think it'll be a domino effect, and then they'll all be chasing one another because they want to benefit from the benefits that we've outlined.
And I used to work, selling to these types of entities, and a couple of years ago, one of the large, concerns that they had was the environmental impact, right? There was a lot of FUD around how much energy a Bitcoin transaction uses, which has been completely debunked now. There was the Chris Larson from Ripple funded Greenpeace attack, which was complete nonsense and being debunked now. But if you're a large major global entity, you are concerned about the environmental impact of promotion of environmentally impactful things. So that has been a negative that I think we've got past, but still keeps popping up no matter how many times it gets debunked. The other thing is just large companies are slow. Another, one of the world's largest global fashion retailer brands I had a meeting with were like, this sounds great, but we're adding PayPal in 9 months. That's our roadmap. And that's 2024, right? So it takes them time to add these things. Again, since I mentioned PayPal, PayPal acquired Venmo. You still can't send money from PayPal to Venmo, even if it's within the same company, which is another good interoperability use case. But these large companies that are operating at that scale are just, it's very, very slow and very, very difficult for them to adapt, and they have multiple different stakeholders that maybe don't have the incentive for them. But I think the climate for that, no pun intended, has changed.
I think we'll end it there. Thank you. Thank you, Danny.
Thank
you,
you
Dan.
all.
Thank
so
you,
much.
Umi. Breez, 1A1Z. If you need a Lightning wallet, check out Breez or come find me and I can make a recommendation for you. PubKey's very good.
Use
They
your
run the
PubKey.
Breez SDK.
Fantastic.
If you have iOS, they're not on Android yet, but we're working on that. But thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your attendance tonight, and go have a good night. Make sure you tip your bartender as well.
Bye.